At 5:34 a.m. on December 17, 1939, Marjatta Alexandra Virtanen crouched in a half-frozen marsh outside Suomussalmi, Finland, wearing her late husband's hunting coat and holding his Mosin Nagant rifle. 31 years old, 11 days in combat, 8 confirmed kills, 0 times she'd used a marsh as a firing position. The local militia commander called it widow's desperation. The Army liaison officer called it the dumbest hiding spot in Finland. But in the snow-covered forests around Suomussalmi, Soviet reconnaissance scouts were flanking Finnish positions through terrain the Finns thought was impassable, and standard defensive doctrine wasn't stopping them. The problem was systematic. Finnish doctrine placed defensive positions on high ground, ridges, hills, tree lines with good visibility, and fields of fire. Logical. Defensible. Exactly what military doctrine taught. Soviet scouts knew this. They avoided the obvious routes, scouted the high ground from distance, then moved through low ground the Finns weren't watching. Marshes, creek beds, frozen wetlands. Terrain Finnish commanders assumed was too difficult to traverse in winter. Doctrine required defenders to hold elevated positions and engage enemies in open terrain. 18 seconds from target identification to first shot on average. Soviet scouts moved through dead ground, emerged behind Finnish lines, called in artillery or infantry, then disappeared. 12 seconds and they were gone. The math was killing Finns. Sergeant Lauri Mäkinen died on December 9th, following doctrine perfectly. Positioned on a ridge with clear sight lines, spotted Soviet movement at 200 yards in open ground, called position. Raised rifle. The 3 scouts he never saw, moving through a frozen stream bed below his position, shot him from behind. Private Oskari Virtanen, Marjatta's husband of 7 years, died on December 11th, following doctrine perfectly. Held high ground near a forest edge, maintained watch on approaches, followed every rule. The Soviet scouts came through a marsh the Finns had marked as impassable winter terrain. Oskari never saw them. 3 Finns died that day. All had perfect positions, perfect training, perfect fields of fire. All dead because they were watching the wrong ground. By December 16th, Suomussalmi militia sector had lost 17 men to Soviet reconnaissance elements. Not in assaults, not in artillery strikes. To scouts who moved through terrain, Finns weren't defending because doctrine said nobody could use it. Doctrine said, hold the high ground. Doctrine was leaving the low ground undefended. Marjatta analyzed it the night after Oskari's funeral. December 12th, 1:20 a.m. Couldn't sleep in the empty farmhouse. Oskari's hunting rifle was still on the wall. His winter coat still hung by the door. The Soviets weren't better soldiers. They were using terrain differently. Every Finnish position was elevated. Every defensive line watched open approaches. Nobody was watching the marshes, the creek beds, the wetlands, because nobody thought you could fight from there. But Marjatta had grown up in Suomussalmi, hunted these forests with her father for 20 years before the war. She knew something army officers from Helsinki didn't know. The marshes weren't impassable. They were frozen. December temperatures had been below 0 for 3 weeks. The surface was solid enough to walk on if you knew where the ice was thick, and if you could walk on it, you could hide in it. She grabbed Oskari's notebook. He'd been tracking Soviet movement patterns before he died. 7 scout sightings in 9 days. Marjatta marked them on a hand-drawn map. All 7 had come from the south, moved through low ground, emerged behind Finnish positions. She traced the routes backward. They all passed through one area, a frozen marsh half a kilometer south of the main defensive line. The marsh was 200 meters wide, covered in frozen reed grass, ignored by Finnish defenders because it looked impassable. Marjatta studied the marsh at first light on December 13th. The surface was frozen solid in most places. The reed grass, dead and brown, stood 3 feet tall, even in winter. If you lay flat in the reeds, you'd be invisible from 50 meters away. If you cut a small position in the ice and filled it with snow for insulation, you could stay there for hours. The marsh wasn't a place to avoid. It was a perfect hide. She tested it that night. Cut a shallow depression in the frozen surface near the center of the marsh, lined it with pine boughs for insulation, covered the position with broken reeds. From 30 meters away, even she couldn't see where she'd been working. The position was invisible. But using it meant lying in a frozen marsh, exposed to temperatures 20 degrees below zero, for hours at a time. Finnish militia regulations required defensive positions to provide cover, concealment, and protection from elements. A hole in a marsh provided none of those. More importantly, if Marjatta was wrong, if Soviet scouts didn't come through the marsh, she'd freeze to death for nothing. And if Finnish command found out she'd abandoned the assigned defensive sector to hide in a swamp, she'd be charged under military law with dereliction. The risk wasn't just hypothetical, it was insane. But Lauri Mäkinen was dead. Oskari was dead. 15 others were dead. And high ground wasn't working. At 5:34 a.m. on December 17th, Marjatta moved into her marsh position. She wore Oskari's hunting coat, wool lined with rabbit fur, waterproofed with pine pitch, brought his Mosin Nagant M2830, 60 rounds, a thermos of coffee, and a knife. The position was exactly as she'd left it. Invisible. Frozen. She lay flat in the depression, pulled broken reeds over herself, and waited. 2 hours. 3 hours. 4 hours. At 9:47 a.m., she heard them. Voices. Russian. Quiet, but voices carry in frozen silence. She didn't move, didn't breathe heavily. Through the reeds, she saw them. 4 Soviet scouts, moving single file through the marsh, heading north toward Finnish lines. They were 80 meters away, moving carefully, testing ice with each step, but moving. Marjatta waited. Let them get closer. 70 meters, 60 meters, 50 meters. At 40 meters, the lead scout stopped, said something to the others. They were directly in front of her position. 4 targets, no cover for them, just open marsh and dead reeds. She picked the lead scout first. 40 meters, standing still. Aimed center mass, fired. The scout dropped. The others reacted instantly, turned, crouched, searching for the shooter. But they were in open marsh, no cover, no concealment. They couldn't see where the shot came from because Marjatta was part of the marsh. She fired again, second scout down, 38 meters. The remaining 2 ran, not toward her. They still didn't know where she was. They ran laterally, trying to find cover in the reeds. She led the 3rd scout, fired. He fell. 42 meters. The 4th scout dove into the reeds, disappeared. Marjatta stayed motionless, controlled her breathing, waited. 3 minutes passed, 5 minutes. The scout was still out there, hiding like she was hiding. But he was hiding in panic. She was hiding in preparation. At 9:54 a.m., she saw movement. 40 meters, slightly east. The scout was crawling, trying to escape. She tracked the movement through her sights, waited for a clear shot, fired. 4 Soviet scouts. 4 shots. 9 minutes. All dead in a marsh. Finnish command thought was impassable. The frozen marsh nest had worked. At 11:20 a.m., Lieutenant Jaakko Heinonen approached the marsh edge. Heinonen was the militia commander who'd called Marjatta's plan widow's desperation 3 days earlier when she'd proposed it. "Virtanen!" he called. "You alive?" Marjatta crawled out of her position. "Yes, sir." Heinonen stared at the 4 bodies. "You shot these from the marsh?" "Yes, sir." "How did you know they'd come through here?" "Because we're not watching here. High ground is obvious. This isn't." She showed him Oskari's notebook. "My husband tracked their patterns. 7 sightings, all through low ground. They're avoiding our positions by using terrain we're ignoring." Heinonen studied the bodies. All shot from the same direction. All within 50 meters of each other. "You were sitting in a frozen marsh for 6 hours." "Yes, sir. That's insane." "That's where they are, sir. Not where we're watching. Where we're not." Heinonen looked at her position. Could barely see it even knowing where it was. "Teach me." By afternoon, 6 militia members were studying the marsh. Marjatta taught them the method. Find frozen low ground the Soviets might use. Create a concealed position using natural materials. Insulate against cold. Wait. The marsh wasn't a death trap. It was a hunting blind. By evening, 11 people wanted to learn. They called it Virtanen's swamp trick, or the widow's nest. Some thought she was crazy. But on December 18th, it worked again. December 18th, 7 to 12 a.m. Corporal Eero Laaksonen positioned himself in a frozen creek bed, south of the main line. He'd studied Marjatta's technique, cut a shallow position, line with pine boughs, cover with natural materials. 3 Soviet scouts came through at 8:34 a.m. Laaksonen let them pass within 30 meters, fired 3 times. All 3 down. Later confirmed, 28, 31, and 33 meters. December 19th, 10:23 a.m., Private Aino Korhonen, one of 3 other women in the militia, used a frozen marsh on the eastern approach. 4 Soviet scouts. She waited until they were 45 meters away, grouped together, fired 4 times. 3 confirmed kills, 1 escaped wounded. Blood trail led south. December 20th, 6:47 a.m. Sergeant Matti Saarinen positioned in wetland terrain the Army had marked as non-tactical. 2 Soviet scouts came through at dawn. Saarinen engaged at 50 meters, both down. Actual distance measured later, 52 and 48 meters. The numbers told the story. Before frozen marsh nests, 17 Finns dead in 7 days. Soviet scouts flanking positions successfully, defensive line being compromised from behind. After frozen marsh nests, 0 Finns dead to reconnaissance in 4 days. 12 Soviet scouts eliminated, flanking routes closed. The technique didn't just work. It reversed the tactical situation. On December 22nd, Major Vilho Tuominen arrived from Regional Command. Tuominen was regular Army, career officer. Everything by doctrine and regulation. "Lieutenant Heinonen, I've been hearing about your marsh snipers," Tuominen said. "Yes, sir." "I'm told you're placing militia in frozen wetlands for extended periods, using them as firing positions." "Yes, sir. It's working." Tuominen opened a manual. Finnish Defense Forces Field Manual, 7-8. Winter Operations. Explicitly states that marshland and wetland terrain is non-viable for defensive positions during winter months due to exposure, lack of cover, and impossibility of fortification. "Yes, sir." "You're violating established winter warfare doctrine." Tuominen closed the manual. Then he pulled out a map marked with red X's. "I'm also tracking your results. Standard ridge and tree line positions. Soviet scouts avoided, flanked. 17 Finnish casualties. Your marsh positions, 12 Soviet scouts eliminated, 0 Finnish casualties, flanking routes closed." Heinonen said nothing. I can't officially authorize using frozen marshes as fighting positions, Tuominen said. Regional command would question my competence. However, I also can't order you to stop doing something that's keeping my defensive line intact. Officially, I see nothing. Unofficially, expand this. Train everyone. Clear? Yes, sir. One more thing. Make sure they don't freeze to death. I need living soldiers, not frozen corpses in swamps. By December 28th, 34 militia members could use the frozen marsh nest technique. Word spread to other militia units, then to army positions in adjacent sectors. The technique moved through Finnish lines like wildfire, not through official orders, through Finns teaching other Finns who were tired of dying because Soviets were using terrain nobody was defending. On January 3, 1940, a captured Soviet lieutenant from the 44th Rifle Division was interrogated by Finnish intelligence. He mentioned something that made the interrogator call Major Tuominen immediately. The Soviets said their scouts have been ordered to avoid low ground, the intelligence officer said. They've lost multiple reconnaissance teams in marshes and creek beds. But they're sending someone, a specialist. Tuominen found Marjatta. They're adapting. They know about the marsh positions. What are they doing? Sending a hunter. The lieutenant didn't know a name, but said there's a scout being reassigned to this sector. Someone experienced. The Soviet scout arrived on January 6th. His name was Starshina Dmitry Volkov. 29 years old, Red Army, trained in Siberian reconnaissance units, 41 confirmed kills across 3 years. The Finns didn't learn his name until later. The Soviets called him Prizrak Bolota. Prizrak Bolota, the marsh ghost. He'd grown up hunting in the Pripyat marshes of Ukraine. He understood wetland terrain. He knew how to move through it, how to hide in it, how to kill in it. He'd eliminated 19 Finnish soldiers in Karelia, 22 more near Lake Ladoga. He didn't avoid difficult terrain, he mastered it. And now he was hunting the Finns who'd learned to fight in marshes. Intelligence intercepted Soviet radio traffic on January 9th. Volkov deployed, hunting the swamp Finns. The Soviets knew Finnish militia were using marshes. They'd sent someone who could beat them at their own innovation. On January 11th, 2:34 p.m., Corporal Eero Laaksonen, the soldier who'd made the triple kill in the creek bed, was in his frozen position in a marsh on the southern approach. Single shot. Laaksonen died instantly. 60 meters. The bullet came from within the marsh itself. Volkov had been hiding in the same terrain, watching, waiting for a Finnish defender to reveal their position by shooting. Then he'd killed them. On January 14th, 9:18 a.m., Private Aino Korhonen was in her marsh nest on the eastern sector. She'd been there 4 hours, saw no Soviet movement, was preparing to rotate out when the shot came, hit her in the right side. Not immediately fatal, but bad. She was recovered by militia 30 minutes later. Died during evacuation. Later investigation. Volkov had been concealed in the marsh 80 meters from her position. Had watched her for hours. Shot her when she moved. On January 17th, 6:52 a.m., Sergeant Matti Saarinen. Saarinen was in a frozen creek bed, observing southern approaches. He'd successfully used this position twice before. 3 Soviet scouts had entered the marsh, 150 meters south. Saarinen was tracking them, preparing to engage. The shot came from behind him, hit Saarinen in the back, 70 meters. Volkov had approached from the north, from the Finnish side, moving through the same frozen terrain Saarinen was using. Saarinen had been watching the wrong direction. Saarinen lived long enough for Marjatta to reach him. He's in the marsh with us, Saarinen whispered. Not coming through. Already here. Watches us. Shoots when we commit. Don't talk. Notebook. Saarinen pressed it into her hand. Patterns. 3 kills. All in Marsh positions. He's hunting. Hunting the technique. He coughed. Blood. Tell my family. Tell them I died for Finland. Tell them the Marsh positions worked. Matti Saarinen died at 7:29 a.m. on January 17, 1940. Marjatta held the notebook, and for the first time since Oskari's death, she felt something beyond tactical focus. Saarinen had a wife in Oulu, 2 children. He died because Marjatta's innovation had made everyone who used frozen marshes a target. That night, Marjatta studied Saarinen's notebook. He'd been tracking everything. Every marsh nest engagement, every position, every time, every outcome. He'd noticed something. In the last week, 7 militia members had used marsh positions. 3 were now dead. The 4 who survived had rotated out before engaging. They'd seen no targets and left after 4 to 6 hours. The 3 who died had all engaged targets or prepared to engage. Volkov wasn't randomly hunting. He was watching Finnish marsh positions, waiting for defenders to commit to a shot, then killing them. Saarinen had sketched a map, marked the 3 kill locations, estimated Volkov's firing positions. There were maybe 10 viable positions that gave Volkov the angles he needed to watch multiple Finnish marsh nests simultaneously. Saarinen had marked 3 as most probable, all in marsh terrain the Finns thought they controlled. Marjatta studied the notebook until 4 a.m. Then she made a decision. On January 19th, 5:17 a.m., Marjatta moved into a position 60 meters from one of Saarinen's marked locations, a frozen marsh with dense reed cover. Perfect concealment. She didn't set up a standard position. She set up 2 positions. One obvious, clearly disturbed reeds, packed snow, visible if you looked carefully. One real, 20 meters away, completely concealed. At 9:34 a.m., she deliberately moved in the obvious position, shifted reeds, made noise, acted like someone settling in for a long watch. Then she crawled to the real position and waited. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. At 12:47 p.m., she saw it. Movement in the reeds. 90 meters away, barely visible. A shape that didn't match the marsh. Then she saw the rifle barrel. Long. Mosin Nagant sniper variant. Volkov. He was watching the obvious position, waiting for her to engage a target or shift enough to give him a clear shot. He'd been there for hours. Patient, professional, hunting. Marjatta didn't move, barely breathed. She couldn't shoot yet. The angle was bad. Too much reed grass between them. She needed him to shift. At 1:03 p.m., Volkov moved, adjusted his position slightly. The movement gave her a clear sight line. 93 meters. Prone target, partially concealed. 1 shot. That's all she'd get. Marjatta aimed center mass on what she could see of his silhouette. Adjusted for slight wind. Exhaled slowly. Fired. 93 meters away, Dmitry Volkov jerked. The rifle shifted. For a moment, nothing moved. Then his body slumped forward into the reeds. Prizrak Bolota, the marsh ghost, was dead. When Finnish soldiers cleared the position 4 hours later, they found Volkov's hide. 9 brass casings. He hadn't just killed 3 militia. He'd been watching Finnish marsh positions for days, taking shots at anyone who used them, forcing the Finns to abandon the technique. 9 shots, 3 confirmed kills, 2 wounded. The rest had missed or driven defenders away. They also found his logbook, written in Russian, translated by intelligence. The last entry, Finns using frozen marsh positions, effective against scouts. Priority, eliminate all users, force them back to high ground, make low ground ours again. Volkov had been sent specifically to stop the frozen marsh nest technique by killing everyone who used it. Marjatta had killed him first by using the technique against itself, making him hunt an empty position while she hunted him. If this story is pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next changed how Finland fought for the rest of the war. On January 24, 1940, 4:42 a.m., Soviet forces launched a major offensive against the Suomussalmi sector. Full division strength, artillery support, armor. Objective: break through Finnish lines and capture the town. It was the largest Soviet operation in this sector since the war began. At 6:18 a.m., Marjatta was in her Marsh position, the same position where she'd killed Volkov, when she saw them. Soviet reconnaissance platoon, 15 soldiers, moving through the marsh in extended formation, mapping Finnish positions for the main assault. And at the center of the formation, an officer. Full uniform, map case, binoculars, directing the reconnaissance. The officer was coordinating the scouts. If he stayed alive, the reconnaissance would succeed. Soviet artillery would have accurate targets. The assault would be coordinated. If he died, the scouts would lose direction. Lieutenant Heinonen was in a position 40 meters from Marjatta. You see him? Center of formation, 370 meters, Marjatta whispered. You can't hit that. Not through 15 moving scouts. Marjatta looked through her sights. The officer was partially obscured by soldiers moving around him. Range was extreme, wind was gusting, maybe 12 miles per hour across the frozen marsh. 370 meters was beyond effective range for the Mosin Nagant M2830. Finnish doctrine rated accurate fire at 300 meters. Anything beyond that was suppressive or luck. But Eero Laaksonen was dead, because Volkov had targeted anyone using marsh positions. Aino Korhonen was dead. Matti Saarinen was dead. 34 militia members had learned the frozen marsh nest. At least 20 had used it successfully. The technique worked, but techniques didn't stop division-strength offensives. Stopping that officer would disrupt the reconnaissance. Without accurate reconnaissance, Soviet artillery would be firing blind. I know the position, Marjatta said. I've been here 6 days. I know the wind. I know the sight lines. You're sure? No, but he's coordinating their reconnaissance. We stop him. They're blind. At 6:23 a.m., the Soviet officer stopped moving. He was standing still, using binoculars to observe Finnish positions on the ridge. 370 meters away. Wind 12 miles per hour, right to left. Target stationary, but surrounded by moving soldiers. This was beyond proven range, beyond what the manual said was possible, beyond what Marjatta had trained for hunting elk in these forests before the war. But Laaksonen was dead. Korhonen was dead. Saarinen was dead. And that officer was about to give Soviet artillery every Finnish position in the sector. Marjatta had been in this marsh position for 6 days. She knew every wind current, every sight line, every distance to every landmark. She'd ranged the exact spot where the officer stood, used a broken birch tree as reference, paced it out 3 days earlier. 370 meters exactly. She adjusted her sight picture, aimed 5 feet left and 3 feet high to account for wind and drop. The officer lowered his binoculars, turned, presented his full profile. 2 seconds. 1. Marjatta fired. 370 meters away, the Soviet officer collapsed. The map case fell. The binoculars hit the ice. Scouts stopped, looked around, shouted. Some dove into the reeds. Some retreated south. The organized reconnaissance lost its organization. Within minutes, the scouts were withdrawing. By 7 a.m., they'd retreated past the Marsh. By 8:30 a.m., Soviet artillery began firing, but without accurate reconnaissance. The shells fell on empty forest and abandoned positions. The Finnish defenders had relocated overnight. By 10 a.m., the Soviet assault hit the line, but without accurate artillery support, it stalled. By afternoon, Finnish counterattacks drove the Soviets back. One shot, 370 meters. Moving scouts, wind, extreme range. After the Soviets withdrew, Finnish reconnaissance found the officer, Captain Alexei Sokolov, Reconnaissance Company Commander. Single round through the chest. The coordination he provided had been essential to the assault plan. Without his reconnaissance data, Soviet artillery had fired blind. The infantry assault had hit prepared positions instead of broken ones. The offensive failed. That afternoon, Major Tuominen approached Marjatta's Marsh position. That shot, 370 meters. Wind. Through 15 soldiers. "I've been here 6 days, Marjatta said. "I know this marsh. Every distance, every angle." "You stopped their reconnaissance." "The marsh stopped it, sir. They had to come through here. I just had to be here when they did." Tuominen stared at the frozen wetland. "You turned the worst terrain into the best defensive position." "It's not the worst terrain. It's the terrain nobody watches. That makes it the best." By evening, 17 militia members were practicing frozen marsh nest techniques in various sectors. Not just for shooting, for observation, for concealment, for moving through Soviet lines undetected. The technique that started as defensive sniping had evolved into a fundamental winter warfare skill. On February 2, 1940, Colonel Erich Heinrichs arrived from Army headquarters in Helsinki. He'd been sent to investigate unauthorized tactical modifications being used by Suomussalmi militia. He observed the frozen marsh nest demonstration, watched militia members create concealed positions in wetland terrain, survive there for hours in sub-zero temperatures, engage targets effectively. Watched Marjatta explain the technique. "Effective," Heinrich said, "but this contradicts established winter warfare doctrine." "Who developed this?" Major Tuominen looked at Marjatta. "It emerged from field necessity, sir. Multiple militia members observed that Soviet scouts were using low ground we weren't defending. They adapted using local terrain knowledge." "I need a name for the official report." "Suomussalmi Militia Training Committee, sir. Collective adaptation under combat conditions." Heinrichs wrote in his notebook. "Marjatta Virtanen, you trained the militia in this technique?" "Yes, sir." "Your name won't appear in the official documentation. The Army doesn't attribute tactical innovations to individual militia members, particularly civilians. The technique will be credited to systematic field analysis by regional command observers. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "If you publicly discuss your role, it could create complications, morale complications. A widow inventing combat tactics looks like desperation, not innovation. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Heinrichs closed his notebook. "Excellent work. Army will evaluate this for broader implementation." After Heinrichs left, Major Tuominen approached Marjatta. "I'm recommending you for recognition. You've eliminated at least 13 Soviet scouts personally, killed their specialist, stopped a reconnaissance operation that saved the defensive line." "Thank you, sir." 4 weeks later, the recognition was denied. Army response. Militia operations are collective efforts. Individual actions, while commendable, do not meet threshold for formal decoration. Tactical innovations are institutional developments arising from field necessity, not personal achievements. On March 13, 1940, 3 months after Marjatta's first marsh nest kill, the Winter War ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland survived but ceded territory. On June 15, 1940, the Finnish Defense Forces released Training Circular 1122, Winter Warfare in Wetland and Low-Ground Terrain. Section 5.3, Frozen Marsh Defensive Positions. The manual described the technique in precise detail. How to identify frozen wetland terrain. How to create concealed positions. How to insulate against cold. Expected enemy routes. Recommended engagement ranges. The manual credited the technique to Field Analysis by Army Observers, Suomussalmi Sector, December 1939, January 1940. No mention of Marjatta Virtanen. No mention of the militia members she trained. No mention of Matti Saarinen's notebook or the pattern analysis that led to killing Volkov. The technique existed. The documentation existed. The name didn't. Marjatta returned to her farm outside Suomussalmi. 13 confirmed kills in the Winter War, all using the frozen marsh nest, or variations of it, approximately 30 militia members alive, because they'd learned the technique and survived engagements they would have lost from standard positions. She rebuilt the farm alone, raised sheep, lived there for 47 years, never remarried, never mentioned the marsh nests, never mentioned the Winter War, never mentioned Oskari's notebook, which she kept in a wooden box. Every December 11th, the anniversary of Oskari's death, she walked to the small cemetery in Suomussalmi, placed flowers on his grave, stayed for an hour. This happened every year for 47 years, until her health failed. By 1941, the frozen marsh nest technique had been formalized in Finnish Army training. By 1944, during the Continuation War, it was standard doctrine for reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance operations. By 1952, it appeared in advanced winter warfare courses. Thousands of Finnish soldiers learned it. Most had no idea where it came from. Instructors taught it as low-ground defensive technique, developed during field analysis, Winter War 1939-40. No name, no story, just procedure. In 1989, a Finnish military historian named Dr. Heikki Lane was researching overlooked innovations of the Winter War for a book on unconventional tactics. He was at the Finnish Military Archives in Helsinki, reading after-action reports from Suomussalmi, when he found a marginal note in a militia log. Marjatta Virtanen demonstrated wetland position technique. 17 Dec 1939. Technique adopted by militia. Estimated 13 Soviet casualties by 24 Dec using method. Dr. Lane tracked the name through militia records, civil registers, property records. Found Marjatta Virtanen, age 81, living on her farm near Suomussalmi. He visited her in 1990. I'm writing about tactical innovations from the Winter War, Dr. Lane said. The frozen marsh nest. That was you. Marjatta was sitting in her kitchen, alone. Grandnieces visited occasionally. It wasn't just me. 34 people learned it. They used it. Some lived. That's what matters. But you invented it. I watched Matti Saarinen die because a Soviet specialist was sent to kill everyone who used the technique. Eero Laaksonen got shot in his marsh position. Aino Korhonen died during evacuation. Marjatta looked at Dr. Lane. The technique exists. It kept Finns alive. That's what matters, not my name. You were a civilian, a widow. You created a combat technique that's still taught. I was a hunter. I knew the terrain. The army officers from Helsinki didn't. She paused. Oskari died following their doctrine. I changed the doctrine. That's all. Dr. Pri Lane published his findings in Sotahistoriallinen aikakauskirja, Finnish Journal of Military History, in 1992. Jäätynyt suo, unohdettu innovaatio, The Frozen Marsh, a Forgotten Innovation. The paper included Marjatta's name, her militia service record, Saarinen's translated notes, and the 370-meter shot that disrupted Soviet reconnaissance. One Finnish army instructor at the National Defense University read the paper, started telling his winter warfare students the real story. The story spread through the instructor community. Some courses started mentioning Marjatta's name, not officially, just verbally during field training. The person who figured this out was Marjatta Virtanen, Suomussalmi, 1939. On August 8, 1997, Marjatta Alexandra Virtanen died peacefully in her sleep. Age 89. Small funeral. Family, neighbors, members of the local Veterans Association. Near the end of the service, 5 people arrived in military uniforms. 3 were Army. 2 were Border Guard. After the service, they approached Marjatta's niece, Kaisa. "Ma'am, your aunt never told you what she did?" "She said she served in the militia during the Winter War. That's all." The senior officer handed her a folder. "Your aunt invented a winter warfare technique in 1939 using frozen marshes as defensive positions. It's still taught today. Every Finnish soldier learns it. Most don't know where it came from, but some of us do." Kaisa opened the folder. Copies of after-action reports. Dr. Lane's research paper. Photos of training manuals showing frozen marsh position diagrams. A letter from the Chief of Defense acknowledging Marjatta's contribution. Written in 1995, but never sent, because Marjatta had declined recognition. "She never told us," Kaisa said. "She wouldn't. But you should know, she saved lives. Still is. Today, Finnish Defense Forces Field Manual 3-0731, Winter Warfare Doctrine, includes frozen marsh defensive positions as standard technique. Section 4-9, Low Ground Winter Positions in Wetland Terrain. The manual still doesn't mention Marjatta Alexandra Virtanen by name. The technique is attributed to Finnish Army Analysis, Winter War, 1939-40. At the Military Museum of Finland in Helsinki, there's a display on the Winter War. It includes a replica of a frozen marsh position, a case showing weapons and equipment used during the campaign, and a placard describing tactical innovations developed during the war. The frozen marsh nest is mentioned. Credited to Suomussalmi Militia, Field Expedient Development, December 1939. In 2009, the Finnish Veterans Association erected a memorial in Suomussalmi. It lists local defenders who contributed to the Winter War victory but weren't officially recognized. 41 names. Second from the top. Marjatta A. Virtanen, Frozen Marsh Defensive Technique. Winter War, 1939-40. The real legacy of Marjatta Alexandra Virtanen isn't in manuals or memorials or museum displays. It's in the fact that innovation doesn't come from headquarters planning staffs or military academies or career officers with doctrine manuals. It comes from widows in frozen marshes, watching their husbands die because doctrine said to hold high ground, while enemies used the low ground nobody was watching. And refusing to accept that established practice is acceptable when established practice is leaving terrain undefended. Marjatta killed a Soviet specialist at 93 meters, killed 13 Soviet scouts in 3 hours using terrain they thought they controlled, killed an officer at 370 meters directing reconnaissance that would have destroyed the Finnish defensive line, taught 34 militia members a technique that gave Finland fighting positions in terrain doctrine said was useless. The army formalized it, spread it through every winter warfare school, saved lives across 3 wars, never mentioned her name. But you know now. The frozen Marsh defensive technique is still taught at the National Defense University, in border guard training, in every Finnish winter warfare course, still saves lives, still works. And every soldier who learns it is using a technique invented by a 31-year-old widow who watched her husband die following doctrine and decided that impassable terrain was only impassable if you didn't know how to use it. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment about which forgotten hero we should cover next. Marjatta Virtanen didn't need recognition. She needed Finns to stop dying because Soviet scouts were flanking through terrain nobody was defending. She needed the low ground to become as dangerous to the enemy as the high ground. She got that. The army took her name out of the story, but they kept the technique. And somewhere, in some frozen marsh, in some winter war, a soldier is lying in concealed position in terrain the enemy thinks is empty. And staying alive because a widow in Suomussalmi refused to follow doctrine when doctrine was watching the wrong ground. The Finnish army forgot her name. But you won't.